Hi, and welcome to this Noodle tutorial. My name is Johan, and in this video we'll continue building out our simple survey app. In this video, we'll create a custom slider component and look at how we can create some simple logic to give the slider some flair with a nice gradient background. First, let's look at the final result and the different parts that have been designed. Some things like the question and the button section will be simple and fast if you watch the other videos in this series. The main thing today is creating this slider. The slider is built up using a few different components, and each step here is a component, and then the whole slider is a different component. We'll also introduce some of the Noodle logic nodes to build out this custom gradient background on the slider items. Let's jump straight to our step 3 page, and just like in our previous 2 pages, we're going to start out with a question. So let's add a text node, and if you've watched the other videos, you might remember that we created a text style for our question. So let's apply that, and then let's fill in the question for this step, which is, how loud do you eat your noodles? Next, similarly to the other pages, I'm going to add a group. And this will be my main content container for this page. And let's also just drag in the button section component here at the bottom. Like I mentioned in the design walkthrough, the custom slider will have a few components. And I want to organize my project a bit, so let's add a folder here where I will put all of the slider related components. Let's call the folder Custom Slider. Now, if I click on the folder's overflow menu, we can add a visual component directly to the folder. So let's do that and call it Custom Slider, and then another visual component that we'll call Slider Item. Since we are in the Slider Item component now, let's start with that. If you remember from the design walkthrough, this slider item will be the bars on the slider that will indicate the different steps. So for now, I'm just going to change the width of the group here and make it 6 pixels. It might seem a bit strange that we're changing the width and not the height, but as we will see a bit later, we're actually going to be rotating the final slider so that what is the width now will become the height. We'll do that a bit later in the video. Okay, so let's go back to the step 3 page and let's add the custom slider component to my main content group here. Then let's double click on the custom slider component to go into it. And here we will start to build out the actual slider. It's just a group right now, so let's add another group in here and we will call this custom slider container. The group is going to contain all the steps in my slider, as well as the slider handle. And if you recall from the design walkthrough, the slider is going to be vertical, but I'm going to build it out horizontally first. First thing I'm going to do is to set a specific width and height in pixels on the group. It's going to be 336 pixels wide and 100 pixels in height. And here we can see in the preview how big it is. It looks good. Then let's also center align it vertically, and again we can see here in the preview where it is if I hover over the group node. Okay, so now I want to add the slider items. They're going to be indicating the steps of the slider, just like we saw in the design walkthrough. Right now the slider item is just a group, and it doesn't even have a background color. So let's go into the slider item and give it a background color, maybe this light gray one. And now we see it here. Nice. I also want to round the corners, so let's set the corner radius to something high, like 100 pixels. And now the slider item has these nice rounded corners, so it matches everything else in the design. Back here in the custom slider component, I want to add more of these slider items. So let's copy this one and paste it. And then let's add it to the group, and here we see the group is laying out its children vertically. So let's change that to lay them out horizontally instead. And oh my, those are some thick looking slider items. Let's go into the slider item and just make sure I set the correct width. And it looks like I did, so this is probably just a small render mistake. So let's refresh the preview window and navigate to the step 3 page, making sure that I click the Juicy Custom checkbox, and now we can see that they are rendered correctly. Noodle is very good at updating my changes on the fly, but if something ever looks a little bit off, it's always a good idea to do a complete refresh or a reload like we just did. Alright, let's add more slider items. Let's copy these 2, now I have 4, then let's copy those 4 and that's a total of 8, and then let's copy those 8 twice, and that gives me a total of 24 slider items, which happens to be the number of steps my designer friend specified. I want these items to be spread out evenly in the group. So let's use the Align and Justify Content property and select this option here, which will distribute the items evenly in the available space, with the first and last items tight against the edges of the group. Let me also make sure that they are horizontally center aligned. Now let's actually use the built-in slider node to get some nice functionality from that. I'm going to drop it on the group here, and that means it will be added as the last child to the group. And that breaks my nice layout, but fear not, we will fix it. First, let me change the position of the slider to be absolute, and now it doesn't interfere with the rest of the layout in this group. I want it to be in the middle or center of the group, so let's set the vertical alignment here. And now we have this slider in the middle that we can drag on top of our slider items. This round thing on the slider is called the thumb. So let's edit the thumb style here. It's going to be 8 pixels wide, so slightly wider than the slider item. And then let's set the height to 120 pixels. And it looks a little bit weird, but if we set the corner radius to be in pixels instead of percentage, we get a very nice looking thumb or handle. Now let's try dragging this around a bit. We can see that the thumb is a bit tricky to grab a hold of with the mouse, but if we edit the track style and make it taller, it will become much easier to grab the thumb. Let's also set the colors of the track to transparent. And now we can click anywhere on this invisible track or drag on it to change the position of the thumb or handle. The way the slider is currently set up, you can see that the handle can be placed in between the different slider items or the steps. And I would very much like the thumb to stick to the steps or the slider items. So here in the general section of the slider's properties, let's change it so that the slider only has 24 steps. If it starts at 0 and that is a step, then we need to end it at 23 to get a total of 24 steps. And look at that, now the thumb sort of sticks to each step, which is the behavior I'm looking for. Alright, so now we have a horizontal custom slider, but I want a vertical one. So let's just rotate the custom slider container group minus 90 degrees. And boom, there's my vertical slider, still working the way I want. I also want to display the slider's current value in percentage. So let's add a text node. When I hover over my nodes, you see that the text node and my custom slider are very far apart, even though they should be right up against each other. The reason for this is that we rotated that custom slider container, so now the bounding box is a bit strange. We can fix it if we wrap the custom slider container in another group and set that group to be the exact height of the custom slider, which is 336 pixels. And now we can see in the preview that they are right up next to each other. Then on the outermost group, let's align its content in the middle by using the correct property, which is this one here. Now let's center align the text in the text node. That could work, but let's just have the text node take up the space it actually needs. So let's change the dimensions and then center align it. Let's give it some bottom margin, maybe even a bit more than that, so like 8 pixels. Then let's also make it use the label text style. The text node should display the slider value in percentage. I know that I can get the percentage numbers from the slider, but I also want to show the percentage sign. So I'm going to use a string format node. This is a node that I can use if I want to construct a new string from other strings, or just want to concatenate a percentage sign to the number I get from the slider. So let's use one of these nodes. I'm going to use the curly brackets to indicate that the word inside of them will be a port on this node that I can connect a value to, and then I'm just putting the percentage sign after. Now let's get our slider value from the slider node here. I'll take the value percent property and connect it to the val input on the string format node. Then let's get the formatted string from here and connect it to the text property of the text node like this. Now you can see that the text node is displaying the slider's percentage value, so something between 100 and 0%. Awesome. Now let's make things more complicated. Let's start by making the slider items a bit more colorful. To do that, I need to get the slider's value into my slider components. I could of course use a component input in my slider item and then hook up all of these nodes here to the slider node, but that would be a bit messy, so let's use a variable node instead. The variable node can hold a value that will be available globally in my Noodle app. Let's add it and see how it works. I've got my variable node and I'm going to give it a descriptive name like slider value. Then I'll get the slider's value property, and note that this is not the percentage value here, but instead the regular value that is going to be a number between 0 and 23. And you might remember we set that up a little bit earlier. Let's copy the variable node now and go into my slider item component and paste it there. Now this node will contain the value of the slider, and it will always be updated as the slider's value changes. Okay, so now we get to the more complex part of this tutorial. We need to create some logic that can control the slider item's background color and set it to be one color if the slider item is below or less than the current slider value, and a different color if it's greater than the current slider value. The first thing I'm going to do is to add a states node. This will keep track of if this particular instance of the slider item is below the slider value, which I will call its active state, or if it's above, which I will call the inactive state. Depending on the state, I want to control a color, so let's add a value that we call color and change its type to color, and then let's start and say that we want the slider items to be this primary color if it's in the active state, and this light gray color if it's inactive. Then let's connect the color value from the states node to my group's background color. Now all my slider items became the primary color, and if I change the state to inactive, they are all light gray. Excellent. This is our first step, and let's keep them in the inactive state for now. The next step is to make it so that only slider items that are below the slider value are active. To do that, we're going to use an expression node, and we're going to compare the slider value from the variable node here with a property from the group node that's called child index. Every slider item that we have in the custom slider component out here has a property called child index. We have 24 slider items here, and the first one has a child index of 0, the next one will have a child index of 1, all the way to the last one, which will be child index of 23. In my slider item component, I can use the child index property and compare it to the slider's value to determine if it's active or inactive. And this works because the slider item components in the custom slider component are all specific instances of a slider item component. So they'll all have different values set for their child index property. All right, so in my expression node, let's write something like this. My index greater than slider val. And then the my index and slider val words will become ports on the expression node. So let's hook up the slider value from the variable first, and then the child index from the group here to my index on the expression node. Now the expression node will be true or false depending on what child index a specific instance of the slider item component has. Next, we want to change the state depending on the result from our expression here. And to do that, we will use a condition node to evaluate the expression's result. So let's connect the result from the expression to the condition property of the condition node. Then let's connect the condition node to the states node with the onTrue signal to the toActive action and the onFalse signal to the toInactive action. I think that's right, but let's see. Okay, so it looks like I have the reverse behavior of what I want, but I can easily fix this by just changing the operator in the expression to check if it's less than instead of greater than. And hey, look at that, now it's working the way I want it. This is cool, but I'm an old guy, so I've seen the movie Office Space, so I know how important flair is. So let's bring some more flair to our slider by having the color of the active slider items be a gradient. I'm going to use two new nodes to achieve the final results, and the first node I'm going to use is a number remapper. A number remapper takes in a range of numbers and maps them to another range of numbers. I'm also going to need a color blend node, which can give me some nice color values that are the result of blending two colors together. Let's hook things up. First, I'm going to use the child index property again and hook it up to the input value of the number remapper. Remember that this is going to be a value between 0 and 23 because we have 24 of these in the custom slider. So my input range here will go from 0 to 23, and I want these values to be mapped to a number between 0 and 1, so no need to change the output range. Now let's take this remapped value as the input to my color blend node, and then let's set up the colors in the color blend node. So let's select our primary color here for the first color, and then let's use this nice noodle orange for the second value. Now, if the blend value is 0, we will get the primary color, and if the blend value is 1, we'll get the noodle orange. And when the blend value is between 0 and 1, we'll get a nice color that's blended between the primary and this orange. And since I have 24 total slider items, we will get 24 different colors, which will make up a nice gradient for us. Let's take the result of the color blend now and use that as the color for our active state of the slider item. And just like that, we have increased our flare level a lot. Let's just enjoy this for a bit. And that's our slider. So all we have left to do now is, just like in the other two videos, hook up these buttons at the bottom so that we can navigate to the previous page and potentially to a future forward page. I'm going to add the navigate node, but you know what? I'm just going to leave it here and leave it up to you to hook it up. And instead, I want to go back into the custom slider node and add a component outputs node and make a port here so that we can get the slider value out from this component. You probably want this if you're going to use this slider and its value in your own app. So now we have built a pretty advanced custom slider, and we've used an expression node, a condition node, and the states node to create some custom logic. There's a lot more you can do, of course, and a potential next step would be to add a summary page to this survey app, and maybe store the results of the different questions in a backend, or maybe just locally during runtime. I hope you've had as much fun as I have building this little survey app, and I hope to see you in one of our other tutorial videos. Happy noodling!